the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I would like to share with you some of my ideas, thoughts on the pair of bishops. I personally like them a lot. I think more often than not, they are an advantage. Of course, there are special situations when we want to sacrifice those bishops. And we'll start right with that, with the famous Lasker combination that, to our knowledge, he invented. A very famous game by Emanuel Lasker, who, by the way, is the world champion who held his title for the longest time of all world champions, for 27 years. This game of his was played against Bauer in 1889. The game started out with a bird defense, not the most reputable or popular openings, but it's just a proof that openings are not the most important things to a chess game, at least on non-professional level. White developed the two bishops, aiming towards black's king side. In the meantime, both sides are developing, quite naturally, castling, timely, and here is the moment when it's time to make a plan how to improve the position, and Lasker chose to bring the knight from the queen side to the king side to assist in the attack, as well at the same time opening up the diagonal of the dark squared bishop on b2. Black responded with c5 and knight g3. Quite a nice setup for white. Queen c7 and centralization of the knight. Knight captured, and naturally capturing back, not with the pawn, which would lock up that beautiful bishop on b2, but with the bishop attacking black's queen at the same time, queen c6, in hopes and dreaming that maybe one day after a d5 pawn would move or disappear, a checkmate could be given on g2. Of course, white makes sure that remains a dream by protecting the pawn with the queen on e2, at the same time connecting the rooks on the back rank and preparing a potential bishop b5, which explains black's next move, a6. And here we are at the critical moment of the game, where white was ready for the attack. Knight h5. Now white is threatening various things in doubling up black's pawns on f6, or in some cases even sacrificing the knight on g7. Black captured the knight on h5. And this is the moment that prior to this game being played by Lasker was unknown to the chess masters or chess lovers. This is a special combination that became known as the Lasker combination after this game, where Lasker sacrificed his two bishops one after another. I'd like to mention that capturing the knight simply with queen h5 would not give the desired result, because black would play f5, locking up the d3 bishop's power towards h7, and then black would follow up by exchanging the dark squared bishops with bishop f6, reaching an approximately equal position. So returning to the key position in the game, here is the combination that I'd like you to remember. And here, the important thing is the pattern, the idea that you remember, not necessarily the exact position. So here it is. Bishop captures h7 check. King captures, and queen captures h5, forcing the black king back to g8, and now comes the second sacrifice with the bishop. If white would want to bring the rook right away to attack from h3, black would get time to defend successfully after f6 and if and when needed, the black king would escape through f7. Getting back to the key position after king g8, now white is ready for the second sacrifice on g7, threatening with an immediate checkmate of queen h8. Black in the game captured the bishop. Let's see what would happen if black rather would try to play f6 and after a queen h8 check, escape on f7. Well, white would have a better option, namely playing queen g6 and creating an immediate checkmate threat of bishop captures pawn on f6. Now, if the black rook moves to f7, trying to create an escape route for the king through f8, then the bishop, on the other hand, would move to h6, not capturing the pawn on f6, and then when the king moves to the corner, queen captures rook with a completely winning position. Let's return to the moment when black actually did capture the bishop on g7. And now, an important element to remember in these type of Lasker combinations, we first give a check, pushing the black king to the edge of the board, that is, to the h file. Black has no choice, because if the king moves to f6, an immediate checkmate would come with queen g5, the famous epaulette checkmate. In the game, black moved in this position the king to h7, and here is the final element to this combination, bringing the rook up to f3, threatening with a checkmate idea with rook h3. The only way black can prevent the immediate checkmate is by giving the queen up, and that's why black played e5. And here comes rook h3 anyway, queen h6, and rook captured, king captured, and here, unluckily for black, even though his position would be quite hopeless already anyway, white had an additional little tactic at his disposal, namely forking the two bishops, after which black could just resign, even though the actual game lasted another 15 or so moves before the game ended. What a beautiful game. I bet Lasker had to feel really good when this game finished. Let's move on and see how this same idea have been used since in numerous games. The next example I'll show you is of my own sister, Judith, against former world champion Anatoly Karpov. I remember when I was teaching my sisters about various tactics, including the famous Lasker combination. Therefore, I was really happy to see when Judith was able to use this very same idea, same pattern, in such an important game, such as against playing a former world champion. Here Judith used the same idea by sacrificing first the bishop from d3. I'd like to point out that this position, while it uses the same exact idea as Lasker did in his game, the pieces are positioned pretty much totally differently, except for the two white bishops and the black king and 3 pawns in front of the kingside position. Nevertheless, the pattern, the idea, is identical. In this position, Judith played bishop h7, just like Lasker in his game. If in this position, black does not accept the sacrifice but moves to the corner, then the white queen would simply move to h5, creating a threat of discovery of retreating the bishop, followed by queen to h7 checkmate. Therefore, still the better chances to capture the bishop on h7. Let's go back, and king captures the bishop, and now came queen to h5 check. Here Karpov resigned because he saw that after the only move, king g8, Judith would have captured the pawn on g7, sacrificing the second bishop, creating the same checkmate threat as we saw in the Lasker example. And now if king captures bishop, then an immediate checkmate comes with check, followed by queen g5 checkmate. Or after bishop g7 and f6, white would just play queen g6, similarly to the Lasker example. And let's see one more example on the same theme. In this case, it's black who can use the very same pattern. Again, as we see, the position is just so different from the other two. Nevertheless, the idea is identical. This is a game played by the Czech Grandmaster Pavel Blatny against Gamboa. In this position, he used the same idea. I bet you can figure it out by now. It's bishop takes h2 check. King captures, then we give the queen check, forcing the king back to g1, and here we go with the second bishop sacrifice, again threatening with queen h1 checkmate. Here it's slightly different. If white would decide not to capture the bishop but move the pawn up in trying to escape to f2, then black should not play, of course, queen g3, because it would allow white to just capture the bishop on g2, but rather in this position play queen h1, because in this case no other white piece protects the rook on f1 except for the king, and black could simply just pick up the rook and win easily. In the actual game, after the bishop sacrifice on g2, white did capture the bishop, and again we're forcing the king to the edge of the board with the check, king h2, and black brings the rook up to e5. Now the threat is rook h5 check, of course, and the only way white can prevent that happening is to give the queen up. And he played queen to d5. Here, of course, black could capture the queen right away, but he decided to do a bit better even by giving a check, king g5, and rook g5 check. And now white has no choice but give the queen up, and came queen f6, and in a few more moves black won the game. Of course, black can win an additional pawn with a check on h4 after white will defend the knight on c3. Let's change from some beautiful tactics to a bit more positional examples. The next example we'll see is being played by the first official world chess champion, William Steinitz. He had the black pieces in this position against English, and this is a game from 1883. This position looks like it's a pretty even position with a relatively symmetrical pawn structure, both sides pretty much developed, nothing special going on. In reality, black in this position has an opportunity to gain the advantage of pair of bishops. And so it continued. Knight g4. This is a very typical move for many openings when the white bishop develops to e3. In this case, that white bishop cannot move away because it's busy guarding white's knight on d4. So white is forced to choose between giving up the dark squared bishop or the light squared bishop. Neither is much fun, but white chose to trade the light squared bishop. Black recaptured, and now white thought, following the famous saying that less pieces, less problems. A lot of inexperienced players believe that if they get to an endgame with equal material, they'll be closer to a draw against a stronger player. This is a perfect example that that is not quite the case. Came knight b3, and black traded queens. Here, of course, not bishop takes b2, because then white would get activity after rook ab1 attacking the black bishop, and after the bishop retreats, rook captures pawn with approximately equal chances. In this position, black continued with occupying the two open files, which is very typical for such situations. The two central files are open and the two black rooks belong right there. White played c3, preventing worrying about the b2 pawn in the future, and black played rook e8, putting the rook on the open file and at the same time creating an immediate tactical threat, namely to sacrifice the rook for the bishop on e3 and then also capturing the knight on d2. That explains white's next move. Knight b3, running away. And here, black played b6, which at first looks weird because generally we don't recommend putting our pawns on the same color as the opponent's bishop. This is an exception to that in order to limit the mobility of the white knight and the bishop to some degree. Now the a5 and c5 squares are taken away from the white knight. White would like to put his rook to d1, but in the meantime the black bishop on g4 stops that. That explains white's reasoning to play h3, and the bishop retreated to e6, and white was finally ready to oppose the black rook on d8 on the d file by rook f to d1. And a very important move, black playing c5. Again, a move that normally we wouldn't like, putting another pawn on that same diagonal, on the same color as the white dark squared bishop is on. In the meantime, in this case, it's more important to take away the opportunity from the white pieces to go to d4 and possibly trade a pair of bishops or a knight for the bishop. White also has no way to go and attack that a7 pawn with his bishop anytime in the near future. Here white played bishop to g5, trying to provoke a trade on the d file and to get control of that open file. Naturally, black refuses to play along and decided to block the threat by playing f6. White retreated with the bishop, and it's time to get the king involved. Remember, this is an endgame. Here we don't need to worry much about our king getting out from its safety zone. In fact, oftentimes, the king is an important participant. Game f3 and g5. You will notice how little by little black will improve his position and advance his pawns in order to create more concrete weaknesses in white's position. Here white traded the rook on d8. I'm not quite sure why, but it's definitely not the only cause for them losing the game eventually. And the bishop retreated, and here black finally put his very last sixth pawn also on a dark square. Normally I would say, oh my god, don't do that. Well, in this case it's not so important because first of all, none of these pawns are blocked by other white pawns on white squares. So they all have the potential to eventually move forward to a different color square opposite from white's bishop that's running on the dark squares. The reason why black just played h6 is to protect the pawn on g5, so on the following move, black could advance with f6 to f5. White played rook to e1, and now black is ready to advance with f5. If white would play passively, black would continue by playing f4 and then advancing some more pawns with h5 and g4. White in the game played f4, trying to prevent that aggression of the black pawns. Now it would be a mistake for black to exchange the g pawn for the f pawn, because that would leave black with the two isolated pawns on f5 and h6. Also, it would be a mistake to play king g6, which would leave the bishop on e6 unprotected and would allow white an escape after the pawn trades with a little sacrifice using the discovery motive, winning a pawn. Going back to the actual game, in this position, Steinitz played bishop to f6, protecting the pawn. And white responded with g3, and now it was time to create more weaknesses in white's position. And black started pushing the pawns on the queen side. If white doesn't pay attention of what black is doing, and for example would make kind of a evading move with the king, black could advance the pawn further, and after the knight moving away, would have ideas such as a3, ruining white's connected pawn structure on the queen side. Moving back again to the actual game. After a5, white chose to play knight to c1, making sure the a2 pawn is protected. So after a4, we'll have the opportunity to play a3 himself, not allowing black pushing the pawn up. And another very important move, bishop to c4. As we can see, the poor knight on c1 is paralyzed now. King f2. And this is a key moment in this endgame when the positional advantage needs to be transformed to a more concrete, different type of advantage. And here it comes. Black captured on f4 using the moment that the white king and rook are on the same diagonal, and therefore white cannot capture on f4 because that would allow the skewer with bishop to h4 check. That left white with the only choice of recapturing with the bishop on f4. And now you would think that this wasn't a good trade for black because black is stuck with the isolated pawns on f5 and h6. But in reality, black calculated very carefully to accomplish an important goal. And that is to trade the dark squared bishops and then to get with the rook from d8 to d2 to win the pawn on b2. White traded bishops. Black recaptured. And white played king e3, preventing from the black rook from entering to d2. King f6. h4. Black traded pawns and traded rooks. And now it's quite obvious the difference in activity between the two kings. Black's king being a lot more active, and black is simply threatening to move with his king and capture the pawn on h4. Sadly for white, the knight is stuck on c1, as anywhere it would move, it would be captured. And even moving to e2 results in a lost pawn endgame, because after the trade, black plays king f4, c4, king g4, going after the pawn. Of course, black still needs to be a bit careful not to capture the pawn right away, because that would allow white to play king f4 and turn things around. However, the winning move now is f4. Now if the king moves down to f2, then already black can simply capture the pawn. And after king e4, the f-pawn is faster than the white h-pawn, and therefore in this position, white resigned. Finally, let's see two beautiful positions. The first one is a middle game position, where it's quite obvious that black is badly missing his dark squared bishops from that open diagonal where the black king is at. I suggest you sit back and try to figure out what is the way how white can take advantage of that. One bishop is already beautifully assisting on that diagonal. The second one is almost ready to come to e5 to checkmate. The only problem is the black knight on c6 for now is stopping it. Well, here is the solution. It's really brilliant. The first move is knight to d7, attacking black's rook. The black rook is in real trouble, and that's only the small problem in the position. Black captured, white captured, and black took the rook. And now white has the perfect opportunity to remove the guard of the e5 square by sacrificing the queen in a brilliant way. So after knight takes, bishop checkmate on the following move. Amazing, isn't it? And last but not least, let's see a very famous endgame position by the known Platov brothers that composed this position in 1905. This position seems like quite hopeless for white, black having an extra queen only for a bishop in return. It's a great example of how the two bishops can work together. The only thing that goes for white is that the black king is in a little bit delicate position. For example, if the white bishop on the dark squares could get to e7 or f6, that would be checkmate. But white would be too slow trying to move the bishop there, because that would leave black time, among other options, to simply free his king from that closed-up position. In the meantime, the d8 square, of course, is guarded by the black queen. Therefore, the correct move is playing f4, taking away that escape square from the king. At the same time, creating a different new threat of checkmate with bishop e1. Now, if black would play queen e4, stopping that, that would, on the other hand, leave the d8 square unprotected, ready for white to give checkmate on. Therefore, after f4, black's only chance is to give up his bishop for a pawn on h3. And now, if bishop takes bishop, then black would have a winning move, queen e8, guarding both of the critical checkmating squares, maintaining a decisive material advantage. But white can do better here, namely by checking first, and when the king moves to g4, which is the only move, then capturing the bishop. Now black's problem is that the king cannot step on the same diagonal with the black queen, because white would make a skewer with a bishop check on g2. So black is left with no other choice but capturing with a pawn. And now we see a beautiful cooperation between the two bishops that black cannot escape a draw. Remember, anytime the black king would step on a light square along this diagonal, the bishop check would come from g2. If after these checks the king would go the other way, the bishop would also repeat moves and go back to d2. Check, and check, and no more checks. But the problem is that now the queen is in the corner, cornered literally, and the bishop is trapping the queen. What a brilliant endgame. Well, thank you so much for listening. I hope you learned a bit about the bishops, and be back next week. Learn some more. So long until then.